Let me show you a handful of my favorite new features in PHP 8.1 that's scheduled to be released at the end of 2021. Let's begin with array unpacking with string keys. I've run into this many times. So as an example, maybe in a Laravel controller, imagine that you're performing a bit of validation. And after that validation is complete, you'll then have an array of the attributes. So for a blog post, maybe something along these lines. Now, sometimes before you pass it to something like post create, you first need to merge in some additional attributes. Maybe you need to force a category ID or a user ID or something like that. So if we were to be explicit here, maybe a category ID of 1, and you want to merge those in, how do you do it? Well, of course, you can do a simple array merge. So for example, if we var dump this, array merge, attributes and additional, and of course, this can work. So if we give this a shot in any PHP version, of course, we get what you'd expect. But yeah, it would be nice if we could use array unpacking like this. Attributes and additional. The only problem is, in PHP 8, this won't work. Notice we get a fatal error. Cannot unpack array with string keys. Maybe you've run into this before. Anyways, you'll be happy to hear that in PHP 8.1, you can unpack arrays with string keys. Which means, yeah, if you did have an eloquent model or something like this, you could now do things like this, attributes, and then also merge in whatever else you need to. Sometimes it's a user ID, and again, sometimes it's something like a category. So in PHP 8, this code would not work, but in 8.1, it will. Okay, moving on. This next one is a little one, but you might find it useful. We now have access to a new never return type. And this, as you'd expect, will ensure that the function never returns. It might redirect, change the location, it might throw an exception, but it will and can never return. So maybe you have some kind of visit function like this. And maybe this redirects, it sets the header location or something like that. Yeah, if we have the never return type, this will ensure that at no point are we allowed to return within the function. Let's give it a shot. In PHP 8, we're not going to get any error. But in 8.1, we will. We get a fatal error. A never returning function must not return. So again, you might reach for these in situations where you should never return from the function. And in fact, if you have this type, it will not allow you. So if down the line you have some kind of check here, some kind of conditional, a year later you perform some check and then return, this never type ensures you can't do that. You'll get a fatal error. So you would have to remove that to make it work. All right, just a little one, but you might find it useful. Moving on, number 3, Constructor Initializers. And this is exactly what you think it is. So as an example, imagine you have an interface newsletter with a single method, subscribe. Next, you have a single implementation, maybe one for MailChimp. Now, maybe within a controller, or maybe you have some kind of use case class called signup. When you initialize and perform this signup, maybe as a dependency, you need some kind of newsletter implementation. Now, of course, in Laravel, you can register and associate bindings like this within a service provider. But yeah, often you want to say, well, give me a newsletter, and if you don't give me one, let's instead use a default one. So you might do something like this, where you say newsletter is equal to what you gave us, or a default implementation. And maybe MailChimp is our default. Now you can say newsletter subscribe. And to test this out, we'll just say var dump testing. All right, so let's go ahead and try it out. Instantiate our signup and run perform. All right, we run it in the browser in PHP 8. And of course, it works the way we'd expect. But yeah, it would be nice if we could just say the default is a new MailChimp newsletter, like this. But as you can see here, yeah, that doesn't work the way we might hope. So if I were to get rid of this and we try to run it in PHP 8, of course it fails with a fatal error. But in PHP 8.1, it works. And yeah, I think this one is especially useful. I like it. All right, moving on, maybe one or two more. Next up is read-only access for class properties. So maybe you have something like a project class, and maybe this is initialized with something like a unique ID, something that shouldn't change. Now, we don't want this value to be changed, so we typically, of course, set it to protected or private. Now, I can instantiate a project, and I'll just stub this out. And yeah, of course, I can't access the unique ID because the visibility is protected. So if we give this a run in any version of PHP, it'll throw a fatal error. And the same is true, of course, in PHP 8.1. So what happens when you do need access to that ID? Well, again, often this is where you will set up a getter. Maybe get ID, and that will return what is effectively a read-only version of the ID. So now, if we give this a shot, and this should all be fairly typical code that you've seen in the wild before, and now it works. We can read that value. But now in PHP 8.1, we can simplify things a bit. We can declare properties as read-only, which would allow me to get rid of accessors like this. And forgive my editor, looks horrible. I don't think it quite yet understands some of this syntax, but it will. Now, read-only basically means it can be initialized once and only once. After that, you can't change it again. So now notice I can say, give me the unique ID, and if we run this, it works. But notice I cannot change it. So if I try to update this to something else, that's not going to work. It's going to throw a fatal error. Cannot modify read-only property. And of course, in PHP 8 and below, none of this is going to work. You'll get a syntax error. So yeah, I think you'll find this especially useful for things like data transfer objects, where you have a bunch of accessors that can now be replaced with the read-only flag. You may find it useful. Okay, last up, all we have time for is enums. And if you're not familiar with these, you'll reach for them for any situation where you have a set number of options. So for example, if you had a compass, this is a common example. Well, of course, your choices would be north, south, east, and west. Those will never change. What about flipping a coin? Well, your options would be heads and tails. It'll never change. What about days of the week? That would be another option. You'd have Monday, Tuesday. I'm not going to write it all out, but you get the idea. It'll never change. Maybe one more, maybe something a little more typical. If you have something like an article or a post that can be published, well, you might have some kind of state object or a status object that will tell you in what state the post is currently. And maybe the options that you've decided on, and these are pretty typical, a post could be in a draft state when you're working on it, it could be in a published state, and maybe it could be in a deleted state or an archive state or a soft deleted state. Maybe those are your three choices for the post state or status. Any of these are examples of an enum type. So traditionally in PHP, we would use class constants for this. So if we pick one of these, we'll do coin here. Yeah, you might have something like this, where you have a constant called heads, and you initialize that, and then another one for tails. Now you can easily access those values by saying coin heads. And if we give that a run, and this will work in any PHP, you get what you'd expect. But now in PHP 8.1, we have something a little more formal, an enum type. So let's rewrite this. So enum coin, or really coin flip. And yeah, our cases would be heads, or it can be tails. Okay, so now I can reference these like so. So if we were to test this out, we're going to flip a coin. We'll accept some kind of coin flip value. We don't care what it is. We can then var dump the output. Okay, let's run it, test, and why don't we pass it heads in this case. Okay, PHP 8.1, it works. But in PHP 8 and below, we get a syntax error. All right, just a couple more things and then I'll let you go. If you want, you can still associate these with certain values if it makes sense. But notice when you do so, it's going to blow up. If we want these to be backed with a value, we're going to declare what type it is, string in this case. So now if you ever need to access this value, maybe for working with a database or something like that, you can use value here. And notice here's your options. So notice the name is what you'd expect. It's the name of the option. Value will be the value associated with it. And in this case, they're the same. But if I were to change this, you get the idea. Now, what's especially cool with enums is they're effectively interchangeable with classes and objects. So they can extend things, they can implement interfaces, they can even have methods. So let me show you. Like, let's do another one for that post status idea, post status. And let's do one for draft and one more just to keep it simple. These are the two states it can be. Well, maybe you want some kind of icon to represent each state. So we could say as icon. And now we can use another new feature in PHP 8, not 8.1, called match. So we could match the one you chose. And actually on this note, this can sometimes be confusing for me in my head. I always think of the one you select as sort of like initializing an object. So this would refer to maybe a draft, or it might refer to published. Anyways, if we were to try this, if it is in a draft state, maybe we'll represent that as like a few dots. But if it's in a published state, maybe we'll use a check mark or something silly like that. Anyways, the point being, things like this are acceptable in PHP 8.1. Let's try it out. Post status, and we'll try published, and then let's figure out what the icon is, and we'll echo that out. All right, in PHP 8, of course it fails. In PHP 8.1, we get a check mark. Hard to see, but it works. Let's try out draft, and we get the 3 dots. Okay, that'll do it for now, and this is only a handful of the new additions to PHP 8.1.